What's up, everybody? Welcome to Heresy Financial. My name is Joe Brown, and today we are discussing the topic of low rates, money printing, and deflation versus inflation. Now, if you've been around the channel for any length of time, then you know that I am firmly in the camp that inflation is probably the greatest financial economic danger that our country and frankly the entire world is facing right now. When I say inflation, I'm talking primarily about monetary expansion and the results that come about from it. But recently there have been a few people talking about how low rates and money printing are actually deflationary. So is that possible? Could it be possible that central banks printing money and keeping rates artificially low, could that have a deflationary effect rather than an inflationary effect? Well, the answer is shockingly yes. However, it's not in the way that you're probably thinking. So today we are going to look at the way that artificially low rates and negative rates and money printing can actually have deflationary forces and what ways those show up. Let's dive in. Before we jump in, I want to let you all know I have just launched Heresy Financial Weekly. It's just a simple email blast that I'm going to send out once per week, and it's going to be a curated list of all my favorite financial or economic articles that I've come across and read throughout the week. It's completely free, so if you are interested in reading what I'm reading and getting a weekly blast of the few articles that I found most valuable for that week, depending on what's going on with the economy, financially related, investing, trading, whatever it is for that week, sign up. I'll have it linked in the description below, and you can start receiving those weekly emails. All right, we now have to sort out the definition of inflation and deflation for anybody who's a newcomer here. For the veterans, we know that inflation and deflation, the classic definitions, if you go back and look back, 100 years, inflation and deflation have always referred to the expansion or the contraction of the total supply of money. Now, the Federal Reserve and economists have different definitions and different categories for the total supply of money. There's M1, M2, M3. So there's different definitions even on what the total supply of money is, whether it's money in circulation, money that's in bank accounts, money that's in reserves. But ultimately, inflation and deflation used to refer to the total money supply either expanding or contracting. Now, very early on, people started to realize that if the total supply of money starts to expand, one of the most obvious ramifications of that is that prices will either go up or go down in response. It's simply a factor of more money chasing the same amount of goods and services that will bid prices up higher to match the new quantity of money. If there's less money in the system, if the total amount of money decreases and contracts, well, now there's less money chasing the same amount of goods and services, which means that prices must fall because the supply of money has fallen, so the demand or the value of money has gone up relative to the goods and services. Now, all of this is obviously all other things being equal, because you can have an increase in the supply of money at the same time as prices stay stable, because if left alone, prices would have naturally been going down. And so in order to keep prices stable, a lot of times the Federal Reserve will print money, robbing consumers of the cheaper or the lower cost of living they would have assumed otherwise if the economy was just left to itself. In the absence of a central bank and with the presence of sound money, deflation or prices going down over time is the norm. In the period after the Civil War up until the creation of the Federal Reserve, you had consistent and persistent price deflation. Meanwhile, real GDP, real wages rose. And so prosperity went up, wealth went up, income went up when measured in real terms, even though prices and wages were actually falling, because the money that people had would go further. Every year, things would get cheaper and you'd be able to get more for less. The total supply of money was staying the same, but due to technological increases and more efficiency in factories and other factors, you had the actual prices of everything go down. And so people got wealthier just from saving, because every year that you saved and didn't spend, your money would go further and further and further. But now, obviously, we live in an extremely different environment than the one that Americans lived in that period between the Civil War and the creation of the Federal Reserve. Right now, we we live in an economy where everything is centrally planned. The Federal Reserve, in conjunction with the federal government, they're trying to fine-tune things and change little things here and there in order to control every possible detail in the overall economy. And obviously this doesn't work. This has unforeseen consequences that just make things much worse as time goes on. One of the dials that they attempt to turn in order to fine-tune the economy is the total supply of money. And so they engage in money printing. Another one that they do is the lowering or the raising of interest rates, again, in order to change the total supply of money in the system, in order to change the cost of capital, the cost of acquiring new money, or the cost of acquiring debt. And over the last few decades, it has been on a consistent trend to just continue to pump more and more and more money into the economy through things like quantitative easing and the lowering of interest rates. Now, one of the consequences of this is absolutely a rise in the cost of living. And obviously the CPI does not capture all of the increases, all the inflation, all the price inflation that there really has been over the last couple of decades. But even if you take the CPI at its word and say, hey, here's the increase in the cost of living, number one, that means that the policies that the Federal Reserve is engaging in are directly robbing Americans of their purchasing power because the cost of living overall is going up every year. If you get a 2% raise at your job and cost of living goes up by 3%, you actually lose out by 1% because your cost of living, even when accounting for your raise, goes up by 1%. So you're worse off because of inflation. Now, the Federal Reserve is very outspoken about the fact that they're seeking and targeting higher inflation numbers right now, which is actually in direct odds with their congressional mandate to seek stable prices. Their congressional mandate is to seek stable prices, but they're so afraid of seeing deflation, or they desperately need inflation so bad that they've morphed their definition of stable prices to say, hey, we're actually going to seek inflation just in case so that we don't actually see any deflation. And again, like I said earlier, even stable prices would be robbing Americans of their purchasing power because left alone, if the total supply of money stays the same and there's no monetary inflation or deflation, then the cost of living goes down over time. The same thing that happens with electronics, where you have computing power getting cheaper over time, and electronics, they're increasing in their quality, but the older quality, they get cheaper over time. The same thing that happens there would be happening everywhere because technology has infected every area of our life and made every area of our life more efficient. And so for our time and labor, Americans and the world, we're getting so much more productivity out of every area of life right now that it should be cheaper. And so the Federal Reserve, they print money that goes directly to the federal government through quantitative easing, through debt monetization. The government borrows. That's funded by the Federal Reserve printing money to buy that debt. The government spends that money then. So all the money that the federal government is spending, the only way they get that spending power, that purchasing power, is extracting it from society, from Americans, from the total pool of purchasing power, the total pool of spending power. So they do that through inflation. So even stable prices would be robbing Americans of their purchasing power, of the additional raises or the additional prosperity, the additional wealth they would have if left alone. It robs them of that and transfers that purchasing power to the government so that they can spend that however they want. But what about deflation? Because we've heard some people talk about recently how low rates, negative rates, artificially low rates in any way, whether they're negative nominally or negative real rates, or even just money printing, can have deflationary forces. And the fact is, this is actually true. It's just not true in a good way, because in the classic sense of deflation, which I've been talking about, where your wealth goes up over time just by you saving, your money appreciates in its purchasing power slowly over time, your cost of living overall goes down every year, things in general just get cheaper over time. That's not the deflation that we're talking about here. You see, when the Federal Reserve artificially manipulates the cost of capital, the cost of money, the price of acquiring new money through debt, when they manipulate that, it distorts economic truths. And so this can cause deflation in two ways. It can cause deflation in prices, which are temporary, and it can cause actual monetary deflation through the destruction of capital. Okay, so how does this cause deflation in prices? Well, a very classic example of this is something like Uber Eats or Lyft scooters. or WeWork. Low rates, negative rates, artificially manipulated low rates, and or money printing makes it extremely easy to fund ventures like these that I named that are producing products that are priced below the level at which the free economy left alone would be able to support. And that's evidenced by the fact that these companies lose massive amounts of money persistently and consistently for years on end. But because they can continue to acquire new debt at extremely low prices, they're able to fund these products without having to actually make a profit or bring in enough revenue. And so the Federal Reserve, through the artificially low interest rates, whether it's negative real rates or negative nominal rates or just zero rates, through artificially low rates, and through money printing, they're actually subsidizing products that could not exist in a free market. Because without access to this artificially cheap debt and with the cost of capital not being artificially low, the cost of getting debt to fund these products would be too high for these companies to be able to afford. And the products that they're putting out would be too expensive for customers to want to pay for in the first place. Now, you as a customer might be looking at this and thinking, well, that's fantastic because I benefit from that as a customer. I get to buy products that are subsidized by money printing, so that maybe that offsets the cost of living increase that I'm experiencing in the rest of the areas of my life, because I get other areas in my life that are artificially cheaper as a result. And while that is partially true, it doesn't take into account the other negative effect and the other way deflation shows up, which is the second one I mentioned earlier, the destruction of capital. Now, the destruction of capital, this goes back to the original definition of deflation, which is the money supply actually contracting. And we saw the biggest example of this during the Great Depression, when there was a massive increase in the quantity of money due to credit expansion and due to bad monetary policy by the Federal Reserve. And then in the collapse, all of that money actually disappeared. It actually destroyed because it was fake money. It was credit. It wasn't real. And so in the crash, the recessions and the crashes, the panics, those are the cures for malinvestment because they wipe out anything that was created with false money. Now, the way that the policymakers and the federal government decided to handle that made things much worse. When you look at the earlier depression 10 years earlier, when the government did nothing, that was handled much better and the depression resolved itself within 18 months. But the fact of the matter is that was the biggest example in recent history of a massive destruction of capital, and you saw prices plummet as a result. There's much less money chasing the same number of physical goods and services in the economy. That means the value of money goes up relative to goods and services, and so everything gets cheap. And so the people who are wise, it rewarded the people who were wise and who weren't engaging in the foolhardy investments and the foolhardy behavior, because then they got to invest in things at steep discounts and reap the rewards for decades to come. But this kind of destruction of capital that we're seeing today is very different. Take again these examples of these technology companies or some of these startups that we see today that are disruptors, and they're using cheap capital in order to fund money-losing ventures. Well, number one of the negative effects of that is it puts sound companies out of business, or it pushes sound companies into starting to engage in unsound economic or financial behavior, because they simply can't compete now, because you have the Federal Reserve manipulating the cost of capital lower, subsidizing these companies that are offering products at prices that are below what the free market could afford. And so if I'm a company that's doing things the right way and offering a product with the free market, and I'm not taking advantage of artificially low interest rates and low cost to capital, cheap money, and I'm not subsidizing my products that way, well, I have to charge full price for my products. Well, now my products are being pushed out of the market by the cheaper products because mine aren't being subsidized by the Fed. And so that's one way that it destroys capital in a bad way, because now you have sound investment being pushed out of the market to make room for something that can't survive long term. And then the second way that this destroys capital is because in the end, when those subsidized companies fail, it actually destroys all the investment that was made into that as well. And you might not see this capital destruction on paper, but in reality, it's there. It's just being disguised by the monetary inflation. You see, if the supply of money stays the same, then any return above zero is a real return. 1%, 2%, 3%, that's a real return. But when the supply of money is steadily increasing and the cost of living is going up, let's say by 2 or 3%, well, now a 1% return on your money, you're actually losing money. Just like in the example I gave earlier about your wages. If you get a raise, but your cost of living goes up by a little bit more than your raise, you actually come out behind. That's like taking a pay cut. Well, the same thing happens with investing. If you put your money in a savings account or in a CD and inflation exceeds the amount of return on that investment, then you're losing money. There's actual destruction of wealth taking place. The same thing happens with these companies. All the investors' money that is poured into these ventures that's actually being subsidized by artificially low cost of capital, in the end, all of that wealth and capital is destroyed. Now, in the end, best case scenario, investors will walk away disappointed and say, my return never even kept up with the cost of living increases, never even kept up with inflation, and so I lost money along the way. But at worst, these companies actually fail and they go bankrupt and all the investors lose their shirts. And the problem with this is when you have an entire society that's built on this and all of the major companies and all the major investors and pretty much all the capital in the entire society is geared this way, this means that when you have a crisis and ultimately these things fail, it's not just a couple rich people who lose their shirts. The wealth destruction takes place on a grand scale that hurts everybody. And so the answer is yes, artificially low interest rates and money printing do actually cause deflation. The problem is it's deflation in the worst way. It's the kind of deflation we don't want, while also at the same time producing price inflation in ways we don't want either. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button and don't forget to go to the description below. Sign up for Heresy Financial Weekly. It's the newsletter I'm going to start sending out every week with a couple articles that I found most valuable so that you can be reading what I'm reading as well. Have a great day.